Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a very interesting and I think controversial, I hopefully wanted to be controversial, book called Mahler's Symphonic World, Music for the Age of Uncertainty by Karel Berger of Stanford University. I don't remember him being there when I was there in the 80s. Maybe he was. I wish I'd known him. If he had been, I think my troubling tenure there would have been a hell of a lot more interesting for having encountered Dr. Berger. He's a very thoughtful guy who's written a book about Mahler that I take a lot of issue with. But I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, it's one of those things that you read it and you'll see what you think. If you know your Mahler, it's a fascinating essay in a newish understanding of what the Mahler symphonies express. Now, you can see where the problem is going to be, at least in my view, right from the title. Mahler's Symphonic World. Great. Let's do it. It's a fabulous world. It's definitely worth visiting. You can make a tour of the world. Music for the Age of Uncertainty. Uh-oh. It's always the wider intellectual context that gets musicologists in trouble, because most of them are utterly incapable of dealing with the issues of the intellectual context of the wider world and how music fits into it. It always comes out like trying to jam a square peg in a round hole. Now, to Berger's credit, he's very, very well read, and he understands, I think, the philosophical milieu in which he seeks to locate Mahler. I mean, quite well. You can't argue with his research. You can't argue with his interpretation of the sources. But when he starts dropping names like Hegel and Schopenhauer and Fichte and Kant, you just start to go, oh no, must we go there? Must we really go there? Does this really have to do with Mahler? I mean, Mahler was incredibly well read. I mean, Berger points out he was probably the most well-read composer aside from Wagner. He devoured everything, and he certainly was interested in philosophical thought and the way that music related to it. And his comments, Mahler's own remarks, show his knowledge of these things. I mean, so all of that, I'm with it. I'm really with it. I mean, it's all well and good. But that's not where the value of this study lies, number one. And number two, I just don't think you want to wade into German intellectual history in the first, last decades of the 19th and first decades of the 20th century. It's not necessary. And then to extrapolate that to the world at large, our troubled age and all that blather about how awful everything is, and what the way that Berger, generally speaking, articulates the philosophical side of things is in terms of a critique of Theodor Adorno's book on Mahler. Now, Adorno's Mahler book actually has its moments. I mean, it's 90% bullshit, as usual with Adorno, and 10% really penetrating and interesting insights. And he goes after Adorno for his contention, principally, that Mahler his positive endings are all hollow, that he did not know how to say yes, that, he was the failure. And the failure is, of course, one of the things that Adorno loves about him, because he was miserable and German and Marxist, and they adore failure. So the only thing that didn't fail was the finale of the Sixth, because it was tragic and negative and completely nihilistic, and that's the way the universe is. I don't think it takes very much to ignore Adorno. I don't understand why Berger felt the need to engage with him, because it shows us that the argument that he's making exists in a very rarefied space amongst a bunch of egghead intellectuals in academia who still care about these things. And if he really wants to have a new view of the Mahler symphonies, and we'll get to that in a second, I think he should find a new intellectual context in which to frame it. I really do. Because I largely agree with his conclusions about how to what the Mahler symphonies do. There's controversy about how he describes them, how he attempts to prove what they do, which is a whole nother issue that we'll get to in a minute. We have a lot of things to talk about here. But the concept is this. Let me see if I can reduce it to its essence. The essence is that Mahler's symphonic message is embodied in his finales, of course, because generally speaking, in a Mahler symphony, the first movement puts out a proposition which the other movements attempt to answer, sometimes by addressing it directly, sometimes by providing intermezzi of different types that avoid the question until you get to the finale. And the finale is going to give you the answer. And he basically says that Mahler's symphonies all wind up with 3 or 4 answers and varying degrees of success. These answers are, you ready? Okay. You have, let's start with the most important one, the adagio endings, the fade-out endings, like the 9th or not the 6th, that's a separate one, not the 6th, the 9th, and what should have been a fade-out ending, which was the 3rd, that Mahler didn't have the guts to fade out. He didn't, he decided to make it loud and pompous, which annoys him somewhat. And Das Lied von der Erde. And it's very interesting. The reason he feels that he finds these to be, Berger does, optimistic endings in their different ways. Das Lied von der Erde represents the beyond simply in terms of the fact that Earth is constantly renewing. There's no transcendental apotheosis. The 9th, on the other hand, is successful and most successful because what he believes Mahler's program is, overall, what they all have in common is that they express triumph or transcendence or happiness despite misery and misfortune, without letting us forget misfortune. In other words, they don't assert a positive conclusion in which the forces of evil are defeated. They express a positive conclusion in which the forces of evil are accepted and which nonetheless represents a positive outcome with the knowledge of all of the struggle and difficulty that entails. Now, this is a very fine point in my view. I think it's correct. I really do. I think it's a very, very deep observation into the essence of what Mahler is doing. But again, the issue is not, is that true? The issue is, how do you show this? How do you demonstrate it? Well, he demonstrates it by offering a kind of wonky analysis of each symphony, but not individually, looking at Mahler's whole symphonic output and categorizing it by movement types: first movements, middle movements, scherzos, andantes, adagios. And as a result of that, first of all, I find that terribly confusing and unhelpful. And that's me. I just do. Second of all, his view of the music is far too limited. He could have gotten a lot more out of it if he was not restricting himself to the usual musicological harmonic analysis and symphonic form in terms of harmonic analysis, because Mahler's symphonies do so much more. He touches on these things a little bit, but not nearly enough. Mahler's orchestration, his thematic types, his archetypes, his use of musical objects, his influences. He's a German guy. He's not German, he's Polish, but he's a German music guy. So Mahler's influence is entirely limited to Wagner, Beethoven, and that school. And that is a terrible mistake. First of all, it's wrong. Wrong! Second of all, it's terribly limiting, because we know, one of the things that, I wrote a paper about it, so I'm biased. But the point that I want to make in my work has been, the influence of Italian music and other musics on Mahler. And the things that he doesn't say are so significant. He does not analyze the symphonies in terms of the thematic relationships between movements. He mentions them, but he doesn't really get to their significance. He doesn't talk about the fact that one of the most important tunes that he mentions in the Fourth Symphony related to the Kindertotenlieder actually comes from the last act of Aida. that, the Italian influence on Mahler's work, the fact that the cry of despair from the Second Symphony is the opening of Verdi's Otello, that the horn theme in the Adagio of the Third Symphony, da 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 da, comes right out of the storm scene from that same opera, Verdi's Otello. The use of Verdi's double bass writing, the influence of orchestral sound. It's very interesting because in talking about the First Symphony, Berger mentions the fact that, it's this beautiful diatonic thing that's as far away from Wagnerian chromaticism as it's possible to get. But then he keeps talking about the influence of Wagner. I mean, the Seventh Symphony, the finale of the Seventh Symphony is based on a tune which is obviously derived from the opening of Wagner's Die Meistersinger. But what's the relationship between those two things? Berger seems to think that Mahler's vision of this theme and this idea of, quotidian daylight, a non-transcendental, a neoclassical comical ending is similar to Wagner's view of the master singers. Well, I don't think that's true at all. I think Mahler's finale is, if anything, a critique. But, we could argue about those things. We could argue about all those things. But my point is that by not going into the range of Mahler's musical materials, his sources, his borrowing, the Liszt piano concerto in the first movement of the Sixth Symphony, the Jota Aragonesa, which is the post-horn theme in the scherzo of the Third Symphony, we're losing out a great deal in terms of Mahler's wider range of reference. Because if the idea is to show how Mahler's finales represent an answer to his relationship to the things of this world, then you've got to address the things of this world that we find, that we encounter in these symphonies. And not just the obvious ones, not just like Frere Jacques and the Funeral March of the First Symphony. So that's one of my main issues with this particular book. I think a lot of the richness and the fascination of Mahler's music is deliberately omitted, and to its detriment. That's one thing. The second thing is, because his thesis entails defining the answer that Mahler gives, and I only mentioned one of them, right? The fade out endings of the adagios, but there's also the transcendental apotheosis ones, the Second Symphony and the Eighth Symphony, principally amongst them. Then there are the comic neoclassical ones, the Fifth and the Seventh, and so those are sort of like the different answers. And then there's the ones that don't really fit, and so if they don't fit the thesis, as usual, when you try and jam a square peg into a round hole, those things that don't fit cause problems. The biggest problem is the finale of the First Symphony, which Berger regards largely as a failure because, he claims, it follows the usual pattern of per ardua ad astra, through struggle to the stars, this idea that the hero overcomes, all adversity and achieves victory at the end. Well, I mean, that's one way that the finale operates, but there's no hero in that First Symphony, actually. Mahler said the hero of the first is born to his grave at the beginning of the second, but that's not how the music runs. That's the point. You spend a little, it's so seductive to spend more time talking about what the composer says than actually describing or listening to what he did. The First Symphony, yes, it does have that through struggle to the stars ending, but it's only the finale. There isn't any struggle in the first half of the symphony, or even in the Funeral March. It's all contained in the last movement, which is the movement in traditional sonata form. You may find it successful, or you may not find it successful, but it's not a traditional approach to the topic. And to claim that by 1888, when Mahler wrote the First Symphony, that idea of struggle through victory was already a cliche. No, that's not true. Not only was it not a cliche in the 1880s, it was still very much in au courant amongst German symphonists and others, but it works today. People love it. And it's the same thing with the finale of the Second Symphony. Now, the finale of the Second Symphony is one of the most overwhelmingly successful pieces of music anyone ever wrote. It blows you away. It is now, the Resurrection, Mahler's most popular symphony, which is really something considering the forces required to do it. 10 horns, 10 trumpets, a choir, 2 soloists. I mean, off stage, on stage, it's expensive. It's a job to put on the Second Symphony. That's why I did a couple of videos about it recently where I talked about how it needs to be an event when it's performed. But in Berger's view, Mahler's transcendental apotheosis is a Goethean apotheosis. That is, striving brings redemption. It's not Christian. It's not about sin. It's not about whether you believe the right things. It's simply the act of striving will carry you forward to God. That's what the end of the Second Symphony says. But that's what the end of the Eighth Symphony says even more, because it sets the final scene of Goethe's own Faust. And so for that reason, because its philosophical message is clearer, the finale of the Eighth, the second movement of the Eighth, is more successful than the finale of the Seventh. Well, if that's true, then why does everyone like the second? And why is the Eighth still kind of controversial as a great Mahler symphony? My point is that if you're going to try and evaluate the success of Mahler symphonies, that success has to be adjudged in musical terms. And the best way to adjudge the success of musical terms is by frankly acknowledging that, well, number 2 is the one that most people think are most successful because it gets played the most. It's a simple fact. And it's absolute hardcore evidence of a work that always succeeds. And he admits it was the most popular symphony in Mahler's day. The second was, or one of them, those things. And, but the idea of just dismissing popularity in favor of this extremely erudite philosophical construct. Well, if the philosophical construct is not the one that leads to the view of the symphonies, which is the most correct according to today's performance statistics, then what good is the philosophy? What does it tell us? I mean, if nobody's understanding it or paying attention to it, then it just becomes an abstract intellectual exercise of no special value. I think it's not that he's wrong. It's that if you want to make the case that this is the way to look at it, you have to address those issues. The issues of the fact that, musically speaking, the Second Symphony is just probably the most overwhelming thing that Mahler wrote. Probably. I might be wrong, but I think so. Because remember, when we were growing up, us older stirs, the most popular Mahler symphony was the Fourth. And that was just because it was financially inexpensive and short. So audiences, it was felt, could be expected to stomach it. But now that Mahler has become a classic bit of the standard repertoire, it really says something, does it not? That the second has supplanted the Fourth more or less. I think or it's equaled it, or that other Mahler symphonies have approached it. There's a similar issue with the finales of the Fifth and the Seventh, both of which, according to Berger, represent this sort of neoclassical comic element with no transcendental thing at all. I totally agree with that. That's what they are. But he thinks that the finale of the Seventh is superior to that of the Fifth. I also agree with that, actually. Superior is a relative term, right? Mahler only wrote 10 and a half symphonies. That's it. And those 10 and a half symphonies are individuals, each one. And everyone's going to have their love of one or the other. And making comparisons is a little bit invidious. It only makes sense within a framework where you're striving for a certain philosophical goal, which he defines. And if you agree that that's what Mahler was doing. But in terms of musical success, well, everybody's going to choose whatever they like. But let us say, for the sake of argument, that the finale of the Seventh is a more complete exercise in the neoclassical comic non-transcendental finale. Let us say that. Then why is the Fifth so much more popular than the Seventh? The Seventh is the least popular Mahler symphony. I think it's a screaming masterpiece. Not all screaming masterpieces are made to be popular. I get all that too. But again, you have to explain why. I also think that both Adorno and Berger completely misunderstand the Sixth. Because the Sixth ends unhappily, because it's a tragic symphony, I think its relationship to classical tragedy, which is what Mahler intended in the work, in my view, and the purpose of classical tragedy and the implications of classical tragedy are completely overlooked because Berger is too fixed on placing every symphony within the same intellectual straitjacket. I think the Sixth is extraordinary because it actually achieves, and one of the few works in music that does this, the idea of catharsis, the classical catharsis that watching, classical tragedy was supposed to achieve in its audiences. And it doesn't involve the death of the hero at all. It involves submission to fate, which is a completely different message. It's quite similar in that respect, if Berger wanted to go there, to the end of Das Lied von der Erde, which is also not a transcendence in the sense that it is an acknowledgement that once we're gone, the earth will simply continue, but will be gone. And those types of endings, I think it's actually, the ending of the Sixth is entirely consistent with what Berger is saying and what he's doing, but he doesn't see it. And the reason he doesn't see it is because of Adorno, because Adorno didn't see it. And Adorno is incapable of seeing it. So I think Berger got a little bit sidetracked there. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's how I see it. And finally, let me just make the point that he does not deal with the 10th. In my book on Mahler symphonies, I didn't deal with the 10th either because I think he's right. I don't think there's enough of the 10th to speak of it as a complete work. But he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to for his purposes. If he's talking about finales, he dismisses the finale of the 10th as not being complete enough to talk about. But it is the ideal embodiment of what he was speaking of in the progression in which he deals with it. In other words, if the end of the symphony, Mahler's most successful symphonies are the ones where we are granted the happy ending despite all of the struggle and suffering. What are the last bars of the 10th Symphony, which Mahler did right? We know what they are. It's a giant outcry for the full orchestra. Da, da! And then bang, in comes this huge chord, and the orchestra subsides into that peaceful, easeful, calming, redemptive ending. It's all in a gesture. The essence, the actual essence of what he is saying that all of these symphonies do. It's there in the final bars of the 10th. He should have talked about them. He really should have, because it would have strengthened his case, in my view. So what do we have? The chapters are organized by symphonic movement types, which makes them rather complicated. Each movement type has a chart. The chart gives you the overall form of the movement in terms of, its melodic material and harmonic direction. I found the charts absolutely worthless because I am terrible when it comes to things like harmonic analysis. Others who are more musicologically adept or adroit or educated will probably find them interesting. That's entirely me. He says actually in the introduction here that, the book is written in somewhat technical terms, though hopefully those who are less technically interested will get something out of it. I got a lot out of it. I got the subject of this video. I got a lot of food for thought, a lot of serious consideration, and a lot of things to me that really didn't make a lot of sense. I'll give you one more example. What the hell? Since we're here, there is the finale of the Fourth Symphony, the song, right? The Heavenly Life. One of the things that Berger does to emphasize the critical and seminal role of the Mahler finale is to sort of create new finales that aren't there. The fact that Mahler asks that movements be played together, as in the last three movements of the Second Symphony or the last three movements of the Third Symphony, that they be joined. And therefore, he says this creates what is effectively one big finale with multiple introductions. This is a distinction without a difference. it neither adds nor detracts from his point. I mean, the finales are perfectly fine as finales, as they stand. And I also, take exception to his view of the ending of the Third Symphony, because the whole point of the view of the ending of the Third Symphony is that the pounding timpani are echoes, reinterpretations of the pounding timpani at the end of the first and third movements. They all end with boom, 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 like this. And so Mahler is transfiguring that at the end of the whole symphony. And he doesn't mention that at all either. His discussion of the relationships, of thematic relationships between movements, is really rudimentary, and it's not really part of his thesis. So he leaves a lot of that out. And that's also, I think, a mistake. I really do. But in the Fourth Symphony, he insists that the Adagio, which is, it's 23 minutes long normally, is actually a big, long, huge introduction to the finale. And because it ends on the dominant, with an open-ended conclusion, and therefore the finale flows on. Well, yes, the two things flow together. They certainly do. But that doesn't mean that you have to reduce the Adagio, which is the core of the whole work. And he says it is, by the way, to the role of prelude to the finale. The whole symphony is a prelude to the finale because all the movements are thematically related. And if he had gone into that in more detail, I think, and tried to expound upon the fact that it was this finale that gave rise to the entire symphony and how it did that, as opposed to trying to rejigger the overall form, in a way which is contrary to what it so obviously is, I think we would have been better off. He discusses the first movement as an essay in movement that expires in exhaustion, despite the fact that the movement ends happily and loudly and quickly after a die-away coda, granted. But I don't regard the die-away as symbolic of exhaustion. The word exhaustion, tiredness, inability to move on. Or is it lyricism, dreaminess? I mean, it doesn't really describe to me what the music is doing. These are terms that fit his construct, but they rub shoulders uneasily sometimes with the character of the music itself. And that is often the case when these very intricate intellectual constructs get mixed up in descriptions of what music does for its own musical reasons. So if that's a generic criticism, then I'm guilty. But as I said, I was immensely stimulated by this book, and you may well be as well. But be forewarned. You need to know Adorno. You need to have read Adorno. You really do. I mean, he says maybe you don't, but you do. You have to know what he said, and that's not easy or fun. And you also have to have, I think, a little bit of a grounding in some of the musicological issues. You don't have to know the harmonic analysis part. I don't think I did, but maybe I did, and I would have agreed with more of it. I don't know. I do think that you got to know your Mahler, and then you can triangulate where you stand in opposition or agreement with Professor Berger's thesis. But it's a very interesting book, and I was happy to have read it, and I hope that it stimulates a lot of thought among all of you Mahler people, because it's always good to go back to music that we think is terribly familiar and be challenged to rethink it. You never know what you're going to discover. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.